I'd like to welcome you all. We have a really, I think, interesting session today, which aims to capture the measures of care in the cohort studies and really try to demonstrate the power of that data by presenting to you some of the recent results on care levers that Sam Parsons, our senior researcher based at CLS here, is going to present to you in the second half of this webinar. I am Morag Henderson. I'm the Associate Professor in Sociology and the Principal Investigator of Next Steps, and I'm going to be taking you through the first part of today's webinar, giving you a bit of an orientation to the cohort studies that we have, the data and the measures that are included that capture aspects of care. And then, as I say, I'll hand over to Sam, who's going to present you some really interesting results on care levers using the cohort studies. So let me just outline today's aims. As I said, it's a webinar of two halves. The first half, I'll introduce you to the data, including the data structure and the types of research questions that you can answer. And the specific care measures that we're going to cover are looking at how out-of-home care is measured, caring responsibility, childcare, but mainly centre-based childcare, social care and social service contact. And then I'm going to explain briefly how to access the data and search the resources. And then I'll hand over to Dr. Sam Parsons, who will describe some of her recent findings from a Nuffield Foundation-funded project, partly as a demonstration to show you the potential of the data and partly to show you the results from this really important work. So let's get started. I'm going to assume no knowledge of our CLS cohort studies. So very briefly, these are the Centre for Longitudinal Studies is home to 4 national longitudinal cohort studies, which follow the lives of tens of thousands of people. Each born in different sort of years. So that we've got the eldest are 1958 National Child Development Study. The next cohort are the 1970, those born in Britain in 1970 and followed up through to adulthood. We've also got the 1989-1990 Next Step study, which is not a birth study, sort of following the cohort members from birth per se, but we pick them up in adolescence and follow them into, at this stage, into early adulthood. And the youngest one is the Millennium Cohort Study, who were born in between 2000 and 2002. We have got some other projects in development, but I'm not going to focus too much on those at the moment, but there are other training sessions on those upcoming. So let me just give you a bit more detail of each of those 4 cohort studies. As I mentioned, the eldest is the 1958 NCDS. They were born on a particular day in that year, and there were babies born in Scotland, England and Wales. We started with about 17,000 and we followed them from birth, meaning that we captured their mothers' data at birth, and then both parents captured from 7 to 16, when at the same time we started to ask the cohort member themselves about their experiences. We also asked some teachers their views, so where you can see school mentioned, we've got some teacher reports and other sort of objective health measures, including as they've sort of aged, as well as height and weight. We've got blood and essentially DNA data collected as well. We've got some objective cognitive tests, as well as some mental health, subjective reports of mental health. The most recent data available to you is age 55, and we're currently in the sweep at age 62. So we're currently in the field, rather, collecting data while the study members are age 62. The next is the BCS 70. They're currently age 51, and again, we're currently in the field for that. It follows a very similar pattern to the NCDS design. So they were born on a particular day in Scotland, England and Wales in the year 1970. We started with about 16,500, and we follow them from birth. We're asking the mother initially and then parents up until the age 16, and then the cohort member takes over as the main reporter from age 26. We also have some teacher reports. We also have some objective health measures, including some of the genetic data, as well as accelerometry data, which captures a sort of movement at age 46. We also have cognitive tests and also mental health measures captured. Next Steps is a slightly unique study compared to the other 3 rather that we have at CLS. This is a slightly different design to the others. It was initiated by the Department for Education in 2003-2004, with the main aim of following teenagers through their secondary schooling and into the labour market. initially, the cohort members and the parents answered the questions from 14 to 17, and then from age 18 onwards, it's only been the cohort member who's reported. Because of its sort of heritage at the Department for Education, we've got some very good linkages to the National Pupil Database, which captures objective attainment, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, GCSE and A-levels. CLS took over the study in about 2013, and the first sweep that we ran was at age 25. So we're understanding a bit more about their early adulthood experiences, and we're currently just finishing the fieldwork where we've captured more information aged 32. And the youngest of our sort of main sweeps is the Millennium Cohort Study. As I mentioned, they were born between 2000 and 2002. This time it's across the whole of the UK rather than Great Britain, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We started with around 18,000. We captured the parent until age 14, and then we shifted to the cohort member only from age 21. So both the parent and the cohort member responded at age 17, but the main responder was the cohort member. We're about to go into the field at age 21 this autumn, and you can see here we've captured information on siblings as well as partners of parents, teachers, and we're going to follow some partnership relationships as they age into adulthood. We've got some objective health measures, height and weight. We've got accelerometry data. We've also got saliva, which has been extracted to DNA and into pairs, genetic pairs. And we do also have the cognitive and mental health checks as the young, age appropriate as the cohort member ages. So that's a very brief overview of the studies. The thing that sort of knits them all together is that in addition to the sort of main sweeps as they've aged from birth in most cases, we did some COVID-19 web surveys from May 2020 to March 2021. So 3 data collections that captured sort of the experiences that people had during that very particular time in people's lives, the kind of period effect of the pandemic. You can see the age of each of the study members in 2020. So we have this additional information about the pandemic effects, and the advantage of this data compared to some of the other data that was used in lots of published papers is that we have very rich longitudinal prior experiences pre-pandemic, so we can see how they fared during the pandemic. And as we're about to release the new data collections for post-pandemic, let's hope, then we can sort of track those experiences over time. So I haven't said much about the sort of typical information. Obviously, today's focus is going to be on the kind of care aspects in the study, but I just wanted to mention the types of typical information that's covered across all sweeps, across the life course and across the cohorts. So a vast amount of information is being collected. It's highly multidisciplinary. I'd say that MCS, BCS and NCDS always had a sort of biomedical heritage. Next Steps had an educational focus, but all of them have since become much more multidisciplinary, capturing social, economic, psychological and increasingly health-based or medical dimensions. So in addition to the information about the cohort member, as I mentioned, we have lots of information about the parents, so details on birth, growing up circumstances, schooling, transitions to education and employment, for example, other measures taken over time, cognitive, mental health, well-being and other physical measures are captured. And as they get into adulthood, we also see how they're faring, not just in terms of sort of quality of life dimensions, but also housing, income, social class, employment, family formation, etc. So it is an unbelievably rich set of resources that is, I would say, almost impossible for us to completely summarise in 1 hour, but just to give you a high-level introduction to what's in the studies. And as I mentioned, the main focus of today's webinar is on care, but the reason I'm showing you the other types of information that are covered is that these variables may act either as a control variable to try to better isolate the association between X and Y. So we might think about poverty or educational attainment being a confounder in the relationship between care leaver status and employment in adulthood, for example. So we may choose to control for this, or it may be that you start to think of this typical information covered as the outcome variable or the dependent variable. So you can bear that in mind as we go through the contents of the sweeps. And so the sort of types of research questions that our data may help you answer on the topic of care, very broad topic of care, it's these types of things: prevalence, so what proportion of people are exposed to a particular thing at a particular age. You can track longitudinal trajectories, individuals going in and out of an exposure and a life course approach. You can look at transitions, changes over time. You can look at sort of what are the risk and protective factors, what associations increase the risk and what associations increase resilience, for example. You can build across cohort analyses, comparing, let's say, some of the older cohorts, BCS with NCDS together, or NCDS with the youngest, MCS. So you can start to build across cohort comparison and understand, or begin to understand, why those differences might exist. You might be able to track inequalities, the gaps between groups, whether those are large or small, or whether those increase or decrease over time. You could try to capture the predictors or causes. I don't dare that we'll say anything too causal with observational data, but we can start to get at this idea of what might predict a particular outcome. Heterogeneity, we're interested in the differences between groups, who is most vulnerable to an exposure, and because we have so many variables, you can get down to quite sort of fine details on aspects of heterogeneity. And similarly, sort of consequences, what outcomes might we see as a result of an exposure, being mindful of the kind of causal language. So keep these in mind as I take you through some of the care measures in the cohort studies, and let me try and do that now. So this is the sort of a list. I'm going to do my best again, sort of whistle-stop tour. It's of the measurement and the variables that are included on these sort of topics under the umbrella term care. The idea is to give you some inspiration, direction for your own research. But obviously it's not an exhaustive list, and I may have missed some. And I focused on these sort of 5 sort of subgroups of care. Care in and of itself is a wide and diffuse term, and some aspects of care in the cohorts I would say are better measured than others. And so I'm going to show you how best I think we capture these dimensions. The first being out of home care, sometimes in care, sometimes care leaver, caring responsibilities, childcare, mainly centre-based childcare, social care, and social service contact. And I'll give you a very brief definition of each of these as we go through. Oh, how's that? So let's look at the first sort of area, out of home care or in care. Out of home care means being, for some reason, a person can't live with their own family, and that could be for a short time or a long time, or until a person becomes an adult. So the way that it's captured in the cohort studies, I sort of want to show you, I'll briefly describe the structure of this table because I'm going to show you a few of them. So the variable description is on the left-hand side. It's not the specific question that's in the cohort studies, but a description of the variable. We've got the NCDS, the 58 BCS, next steps, and MCS in columns in order from oldest to youngest. Each of the numbers denote the age at which the variable was captured. So for NCDS, you can see whether or not the cohort member had ever been in care is captured at age 7, 11, 16, 23, etc. And you can see the subsequent ages for the different cohorts. Everything that's in black is about the cohort member themselves, but we do also have this intergenerational aspect because we have some information about the parents' care experience, as well as the cohort member's children. So where it's green, it's about the cohort member's parent, and where it's orange, it's about the cohort member's children. And just even this slide shows how complex the data is. So I appreciate it might take a few run-throughs before you fully capture what's in the data. So just to show you then, ever been in care is captured very frequently and well for NCDS, BCS, and next steps. It can be computed from the other variables in the Millennium Cohort Study. So we know there's a reason for care question, which will also tell you essentially whether the cohort member has ever been in care. We've got age of care, duration of care, period of care captured sort of differentially across the cohorts. And then for the Millennium Cohort Study, you see quite a lot of information about the parents' experience of care, in addition to the cohort members' experience of care. So that's a sort of high-level introduction to that. Moving to the next type of care in the cohorts, we're thinking about caring responsibilities. And these are essentially responsibilities for caring families or people outside of the home across the life course. So this table will become more and more familiar to you. What you can see here is that next steps, there's quite a lot of young carer measures between the age of 14 and 19, including number of hours, who they regularly take care of, frequency of missing school due to caring responsibilities, and for NCDS and BCS 70, you can see that the caring responsibility measures capturing information about either their partner, their mother or father, or their partner's parents. So there's a sort of life course aspect difference there. For the Millennium Cohort Study, the questions are about at age 17 mainly. So as they become more sort of older teenagers, you sort of see and capture that information. For the COVID-19 sweeps, the ones I mentioned from May 2020 to March 2021, there's a question across all cohorts about frequency of giving help to people in the past 7 days. Childcare, this is capturing mainly centre-based childcare. So I sort of started doing this and it was such a massive and mammoth task. There are obviously lots of information on parenting, so the kind of instrumental care, time use, emotional closeness, financial transfers, and other types of help that parents may give their children. But for ease and truth, I focused on the centre-based childcare or organised childcare because parenting sort of just seems a somewhat adjacent to the care topic in and of itself. So just to show you, this captures childcare arrangements across all of the cohorts. For NCDS, it's really only about the cohort members' children, so you can understand whether or not they are going to playgroup or nursery or those experiences. They also ask about how much they paid for childcare. It's similar for BCS. We capture the cohort members' childcare experiences at birth and at age 5, but in adulthood, it's about the cohort members' children. Next steps. It's captured for their own children, so quite kind of young mums and dads at age 17 to 25, and there's a question about affordability. And for MCS, it's all about the cohort members' experience of childcare, where they went, hours and amount paid for. The sort of penultimate topic is about social care. So in England, social care is defined as the provision of social work, personal care, protection of social support services to children or adults in need or at risk, or adults with needs arising from illness, disability, old age, or poverty. And I'd say this is the one topic that I would say that we are, there's no real direct measure of social care receipt, but I'll show you some proxies that I think could be used as a potential measure to capture dimensions of social care as I've defined it. So the kind of topics we capture, we have a lot of health measures in these cohorts. So there's self-assessed general health. We've also got medical conditions, so we may be able to infer from the particular medical condition whether or not they are in receipt of social care. For next steps, it's not such a detailed list. It's more about long-term illness, long-standing illness, so it might not capture all medical conditions. But we do have our data linked to the health records, including hospital episode statistics and outpatient care. So we may be able to identify care dimensions through that route. We regularly ask about benefits, disability living allowance or incapacity benefit across all of the cohorts at multiple ages. And obviously the sort of definition of the benefits of each period may be slightly different, but I think there's some work that you could do there to identify if they're in receipt of benefits. Disability status is only really, registered disabled status is only really captured at NCDS, BCS and next steps. But special educational needs, which may overlap with disability, are captured pretty comprehensively in the younger two studies. And explicitly, next steps, BCS and MCS ask a question about whether they get help due to a disability or a problem. The COVID-19 sweeps also capture a lot of information on self-rated health, long-standing illness, and whether they identify as being in a vulnerable category. And then there's some specific questions about whether they received help in the last sort of, recent period for the wave 2 and 3 of the COVID-19 sweeps. So the last topic under care is reasonably self-explanatory, whether or not they were in contact with any of the sort of agencies. So social services being one and educational welfare services being another. For all of them, NCDS, BCS and Next Steps are captured relatively frequently throughout childhood and into teenage years. And for MCS, it's captured only at quite a young age. And the question is about whether or not they've both spoken with, whose idea it was to speak to a social worker, for example, and what their satisfaction was. So there's some work around that you could do. Just briefly, because of the interest of time, just how to access the data and some resources. So the first thing is to access and download the data. You can get it freely available to researchers from the UK Data Service. So you can just search for the Millennium Cohort Study, Next Steps, British Cohort Study or National Child Development Study, and download it direct to your computer. If there are more sensitive data, then you may need to go through some additional training or other applications, but the CLS website will have information on that. And what's considered secure are things like the exam results, so National Pupil Database or any sort of geographical identifiers. Additional resources, I'd say go to the CLS website, go to the UKDS, there are user guides, questionnaires, exact wording, there's documentation about what data, what variables have been derived and the coding frames around that. There's technical reports. You can search through the data dictionaries, or you can also search through previous journal publications. And this is a useful resource. It's called Closer Discovery. It captures most of the sweeps for our 4 cohorts. Not all are up there just yet, but you can search for specific keywords in the variable. So here I put in one that's called politics, and then what comes up is any question that includes or any tag that has the term politics, and you can select by study or life stage or topic. And it's quite a nice way to try and find whether or not there's a variable captured. Just to mention before I hand over to Sam, there's also ongoing training and support. So if you have questions about the data that we can't answer today, then you could use the CLS feedback email address, which will be on these slides. And again, these slides will be shared with you after the event. And also the training and support page on the CLS website has lots of videos that will help introduce you in more detail to the data, should you want it. So now I'm going to hand over to Sam Parsons, who's going to give a talk about her recent findings on care leavers and their children.
So I'm going to talk about care leavers and their children, so offering up an intergenerational perspective. This study is actually has been one of the first to examine the experiences of care leavers who become parents. And I'm going to use information from the 1970 and the Millennium cohort. And by using the 1970 cohort, we're able to compare against the experiences of the cohort members themselves who have spent time in out-of-home care. So just briefly, the motivation for this study was that in England there are currently around 80,000 children in local authority care, and there's a rich evidence base that shows that care leavers are at an increased risk of low education attainment, unemployment and low socioeconomic status, experience unstable family relationships and early parenthood, and experience poor mental and physical health. We initially had 3 research questions. This project was funded prior to the pandemic. However, the pandemic gave us rise to additional research opportunities. And so our second research question, to what extent does parental care experience impact on their children's development, was developed so that we could look specifically at how out-of-home care experience was associated with the health and well-being of care leavers during the pandemic. So I'm going to give quite a brisk overview of the findings, both descriptive associations and from more complex regression modelling, which takes into account differences in individual and family background characteristics. So this will necessarily be quite a rapid run through. However, this is a list of the project outputs we've got to date, and all of these are available on the project website via the CLS website. So please do take a look there if you're interested in any of the results in particular, And as Morag said, please do keep popping questions into the chat and I'll have a go at answering queries at the end of the presentation. So first, I'm going to recap about how out-of-home care experience has been captured in these two studies. So firstly, in BCS 70, the mother was asked about time she had spent away from her own parents, and this was included in the second survey, so that was carried out in 1975, when the cohort child was age 5. And then the parent guardian, well, and also just to note that for this cohort, it's overwhelmingly the mother who completes the interviews. And she was asked about whether the cohort child had themselves been in care in interviews that took place again at age 5, but additionally at 10 and 16. And then the cohort members were themselves asked about their own care experience retrospectively when they were 30. In MCS, the parent was asked about time living away from both of their parents, and if yes, where they specifically spent this time. And there were additional follow-on questions about length of time in care and age they first entered into care. So on to prevalence. In BCS 70, over 12,000 mothers answered the question about her own experience, of which 3% had been in care. And amongst this sample of mothers, their children, over 4% had been in care, with a further 48 had the children had been in care and also the mother had been in care. So what we've been able to do with this is that although we see that children of mothers who have spent time in care are more likely than children of mothers with no care experience to have experienced care themselves, the vast majority do not end up in care themselves. And this is a picture that's quite contrary to as it's often presented in the wider media. So in MCS, our sample consists of over 18,000 families, and amongst these we've got 456, or 2.4% of parents, who had spent time in out-of-home care. And for this cohort, we additionally know whether it was the mother or father who had been in care. And we can see that a very small sample of 10 children, that both their mother and father had been in care. So starting with research question 1, what are the social and economic resources available to parents who had care experience as children? And so to answer this question, we focused on the experiences of mothers with care experience during the very early years of their child's life, and we focus on the Millennium Cohort Study. And specifically, we've covered differences in these 6 areas. So demographic characteristics, including family status, experiences during pregnancy and childbirth, employment and finances, housing conditions and local environment, parenting styles, and health behaviours and general well-being. So what we found was that mothers who experienced out-of-home care in their childhood have poorer socioeconomic and psychosocial resources available to them in adulthood compared to other mothers. However, when their age, ethnicity and qualification levels are accounted for in the regression analyses, many differences in experiences during pregnancy, childbirth and parenting were no longer significant. The key differences that remained of concern were their low levels of education, being part of a poor workless household and or in receipt of state benefits, living in damp rented housing in a deprived area with fewer amenities, to have poor mental and physical health, and to not to see themselves as being a good parent, with few reporting having regular contact with their own parents. So key messages from this. So this profile of care experienced mothers adds to the previous evidence and confirms that female care leavers who become mothers experience disadvantage in a myriad of ways during their child's earliest years. These disadvantages are highly likely to negatively impact the future development of their children, thereby perpetuating the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage associated with out-of-home care. The fact that many mothers with care experience have not completed their basic education and left school with low levels of qualifications is a key area policy can address. There should be support for lifelong education, enabling young people with care experience and young mothers who have left school early due to their traumatic experiences at home to return to education, to acquire appropriate qualification and facilitate their efforts for up and reskilling. The provision of adequate housing to young mothers who grew up under the guardianship of the state is also a vital support structure that must be put into place. The wider stresses associated with socioeconomic disadvantage and poor housing conditions are clear to see amongst these care experienced mothers. Add this mix to prior experience of the care system, it is not surprising that poor physical and mental health and higher levels of diagnosed depression exist amongst our care experienced mothers. Okay, moving on to research question 2. To what extent does parental care experience impact on their children's development? So here we've examined the extent of educational inequality of children of care leavers from preschool to public examinations at age 16. We look at early post-16 education transitions, and then we move we look at the education and employment outcomes in early and mid-adulthood using the older 1970 cohort before comparing the health and well-being outcomes using both studies. So we look at education attainment and inequality at 3 age points. At age 3 with the Bracken School Readiness Assessment, and this is a screening instrument to assess the readiness of a child for formal education. At age 5, we use the Early Years Foundation Stage Assessment, and this is completed by teachers of children at school in England during the final term of reception year in primary school. And then finally, GCSE exam results at age 16. The MCS teenagers sat their GCSEs in 2016 or 17 and reported their grades when interviewed in 2018. And here we have identified the proportion of students who got 5 or more good grade GCSE exam passes, including English and maths. So in old money, that's a grade C or higher, and in the current grading system, it's grade 4 to 9. So this graph shows the raw association between parent out-of-home care experience and education outcomes in their children in the preschool years at school entrance and in GCSE examinations at the end of year 11. We see that although the majority of children were assessed as being school ready at 3 and were at or above the expected level in the early years assessment by teachers, and actually went on to gain the threshold of 5 or more grade 4 to 9 GCSEs at 16, the raw percentages show evidence of educational disadvantage amongst children of care leavers at each stage, with actually the gaps increasing over time. So this chart shows the odds ratios for children of a parent with care experience gaining 5 or more grade 4 to 9 GCSEs compared to children with no parent out-of-home care experience. And these are the results from a series of regression models. The relationship is significant if the odds do not cross the vertical 1 line. And so in model 1 at the top of the chart, we see that compared to children with no parent care experience, they have significantly reduced odds, but that once inequalities in family socioeconomic background or area deprivation and housing are controlled for, that's in model 2 or model 3, children of care leavers are as likely to gain 5 or more good grade public examinations at 16 as those whose parents had no experience of being in care. We observed this same pattern of results when looking at being school ready at 3 or at or above the expected level at age 5 by teacher assessment. It is thus not parental care experience per se, but the additional risk factors experienced by care leavers that affect the educational progression and attainment of their children. Okay, we're turning now to early post-16 transitions. And here we found that the teenage children of care leavers demonstrate resilience and optimism for their future. For the teenage children of care experienced mothers, the main chart again shows their odd ratios from logistic regression models, and the inset smaller chart, their coefficient from OLS regression modelling after adjusting for a child's age, sex, ethnicity, GCSE attainment and family background socioeconomic characteristic measures, and that's in all of the models. And here we can see that the teenage children of care experienced mothers have similar aspirations regarding attending university or entering into a professional occupation, and they are just as likely to be in employment, education or training at age 17 as their peers. So again, key messages. Our analysis here has highlighted how crucial parental education levels, employment and housing conditions are in shaping the education outcomes for children of care leavers and for successful post-16 aspirations and transitions. We have seen the optimism and resilience they have for their future. Although the parents with care experience in this research experience care systems and policies from the 1950s to the 2000s, the findings are just as pertinent for stopping the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage amongst more recent care leavers and their future children, as care leavers today remain more likely to be poorly educated and to be in poor housing. So interventions aiming to support the education attainment of care leavers, their housing needs and a smooth transition into the labour market are vital to break the vicious cycle, as are measures to support the education attainment of their children. And just to reiterate again, it's not parental care experience, but the additional risk factors experienced by care leavers that affect the education progression and attainment of their children. So we extend this picture now by turning to the 1970 cohort to examine education and employment outcomes in adulthood. So we look first at highest achieved qualification, and we see here that cohort members with direct care experience, so they themselves have been in care as in their childhood, are the most disadvantaged in that more don't achieve any qualifications and fewer have gone on to achieve a degree or equivalent qualification, although it has to be said on a positive note, some have. However, we also see evidence of disadvantage amongst those with a mother with out-of-home care experience, particularly among men. On a more positive note, it's good to note that a similar percentage of women whose mothers have been in care went on to gain a degree or equivalent by age 26 as women whose mothers have not been in care. And we see here it's 20% compared to 19%. Turning now to time spent in education, employment or training, or EAT, we make full use of the economic activity history data that has been collected about every activity a cohort member has been in at every wave of data collection in adulthood. So this graph shows the percentage of men who had spent the majority of months in any 1 year in EAT over a 30-year period from 1987 to 2016. So it's from when the year they turned 17 to when they're 46. We can see that those with direct care experience are the most disadvantaged, and that's the line at the bottom of this graph. But the disadvantage is also evident for children of mothers with care experience, and that this disadvantage is very evident in each year over the 30-year time frame. And again, we can see a very similar pattern for women, with those with direct care experience being the most disadvantaged, but that this disadvantage is also in evidence for women whose mothers have been in care. So turning to health and well-being. So for these outcomes, we've used both MCS and the 1970 cohort. And here we do find that care experience casts a very long shadow. And again, for BCS 70, we additionally compare experiences for those who have experienced care themselves. So first off, for MCS, here we find stark evidence of mental health problems and a risk of self-harm and suicide. So unlike the resilience that was evident for education outcomes, here we see that inequalities in family socioeconomic background, area deprivation, housing and a child's own educational attainment do not attenuate the association between maternal out-of-home care experience and the higher levels of behavioural and mental health problems, including self-harm and suicide attempts amongst their teenage children. This is a truly distressing area of research. Turning to BCS 70 at age 50, here we do see evidence of resilience amongst those whose mother had care experience. So this analysis was looking at health outcomes amongst 50-year-olds during the pandemic and how this varied by out-of-home care out-of-home care experience, both maternal and their own direct experience of being in care as children. So this figure shows that the negative association between a cohort member's own experience of out-of-home care and their general and mental health are not attenuated by inclusion of their background characteristics, but also their current living, qualification and employment circumstances. And this adds to the vast body of evidence on the long shadow cast by care experience, which continues into the 5th decade of life. But importantly, as observed here, we show that this shadow does not necessarily affect the children of care leavers, many of whom we found to be just as well adjusted as the next person. So key messages from this part of our research. In MCS, we have seen how parental care experience casts a very long shadow on the mental well-being of their children, illustrating the continued disadvantage and trauma into the second generation. The teenagers of parents with out-of-home care experience reported higher levels of behavioural and mental health problems, including experience of self-harm and suicide attempts. This constellation of negative mental well-being outcomes clearly highlights the vital need to better support families with care experience across the generations, and for more research to understand what the key drivers of these negative associations are. In the older 1970 cohort, we found those with direct out-of-home care experience some 30 to 40 years earlier remain at a greater risk of reporting poor general and mental health and higher levels of depression during the pandemic. But we did, however, find evidence of resilience amongst those whose mothers had care experience. So finally, on to our third research question. So what are the factors and processes that promote positive development amongst children of care experienced parents? And for this research, we have focused exclusively on the mothers who had care experience before the age of 17 in the Millennium cohort, acknowledging and identifying the heterogeneity of experience amongst care leavers and how the education and wellbeing outcomes for their children may vary. So we have identified 3 groups of care experienced mothers after classifying them from a range of characteristics, including their education attainment, employment status, finances, housing, physical and mental health. And these 3 groups of care experienced mothers we have labelled as resilient, impoverished and distressed. So I know this is a bit of a busy slide, but I wanted to clearly show how the characteristics and experiences of the 3 groups of care leavers mothers vary. So many of the resilient mothers are educated, very few are single mothers, in poverty or in a workless household, and less than half are in rented housing. In comparison, we can see far more of the impoverished mothers are young mothers, have no qualifications, almost all are in poverty, receive state benefits and live in rented housing in a deprived area that they don't think is a good area to bring up their children. Although we can also see many of these higher rates amongst the distressed families, it is with this set of characteristics that are now on the screen that identifies this group of mothers as having more distressing or chaotic lifestyles, from being more likely to have a partner who has used force on them, to living in a disorganized home that does not have a calm atmosphere where they can't hear themselves think. These mothers also have a higher probability of having a long-standing illness, to have been diagnosed with depression and to self-report experience a high number of depressive symptoms. So the next stage was to explore the associations between the subgroup membership among the parent generation and adjustment of their children regarding their education and mental well-being. In the modelling, we adjusted for the teenagers' sex, age at interview and ethnicity, and used the resilient mother group as the reference group. The findings suggest that the children of resilient care leaver mothers were more likely than their peers with impoverished or distressed mothers to have achieved 5 or more grade 4 to 9 GCSEs. More than half of the children of resilient mothers achieved this standard, and also more than half expected to go on to university. And this puts them more or less on a par with their peers in the general population sample. Regarding their mental health outcomes, there are, however, no significant differences between the teenagers by maternal care experience. The teenage children of resilient care leaver mothers report similar levels of mental health problems and distress as the children of impoverished and distressed care leaver mothers. And if anything, they even report higher levels of being treated for depression and self-harm, although these differences do not differ significantly. So a few final comments. So this research has identified different aspects of intergenerational transmission of disadvantage and trauma that occurs in families where the parent had out-of-home care experience, but has importantly found evidence of resilience in their children. It has particularly highlighted the importance education and qualifications have for enabling resilience in outcomes for both care experienced mothers and their children. However, the findings illustrate the need for parents with out-of-home care experience and their children to have ongoing access to support structures aiming to limit the cast of the long shadow of care experience among these most vulnerable families, particularly in regards to their mental well-being. And finally, just to draw attention to strengths and limitations, a key strength of this research lies in its use of 2 longitudinal birth cohort studies, which has included a question on parental care experience. And this has provided a rare opportunity to examine the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, and we have been able to draw attention to the experiences of the children of care leavers across different domains of life and highlight where differences do and actually do not exist in comparison to their peers. And in particular to highlight where the lives of children of mothers with care experience are more challenging to hopefully inform the design of effective support structures and initiatives. However, we must also acknowledge that we do not know how many people with care experience did not agree to take part in the studies, and therefore our sample of care leaver parents and mothers may already be relatively well adjusted and functional compared to all those with care experience. So if anything, our findings might thus show a more positive picture of the challenges faced by care leavers who become mothers and then by definition their children. So thank you.